So to start off with, would you mind just doing like a short introduction about who you are and what you do?
Yes, my name's Dr. Vicky Palmer, and I work at Nottingham Trent University as a senior lecturer, mainly but not solely teaching on the BA Honours Youth Justice degree. So I teach all years, all levels of students on the course. I occasionally contribute to lectures on the criminology degree as well as the social work degree. And my main task obviously is lecturing, but I also contribute to the student experience. I organise and take students on trips, sometimes international.
Yeah. Could you tell us more about your journey and what inspired you to teach youth justice?
Well, it was a strange and convoluted journey, really. So my first degree as an undergraduate was BA Honours Business Studies.
Right.
It was a business studies degree, which I didn't like at all. So following graduation, I just looked in the newspapers to see what kind of jobs jumped out of the page at me. And the one I settled on was working at a hostel for homeless ex-offenders down in Swindon.
Wow.
And it was whilst working there that I got to meet many probation officers that would come in and do their work with the offenders. So I decided to become a probation officer myself. So I went and did the training. The training at that time was the Certificate in Qualified Social Work, which enabled you to be either or both a social worker and a probation officer. And I opted for probation as the more interesting of the routes. So I spent 20 years as a probation officer, starting off in Leicestershire in Colville, and then moving to the North Notts ex-mining villages like Sutton in Ashfield, Kirkby in Ashfield, and Mansfield. It was whilst I was doing that that it was clear that I was particularly adept at working with the younger offenders, that many of the more traditional probation officers would kind of shy away from because they are like a different class of offender, if you like. But I enjoyed that. So I was then taken on to be the dedicated probation officer, the seconded probation officer, into a newly established youth offending team at Mansfield. I spent 7 years there and thoroughly enjoyed the work. And it was in doing that work that my name became known for my abilities to work effectively, really well with young offenders. And I was tracked down by the university and then asked to come and teach here, first by writing or helping to write an entire degree course on youth justice. So that's how I came really to Nottingham Trent University. It was straight out of practice, straight into the teaching side of it. So I now teach people to do what I used to do. Yeah.
Wow, yeah, I mean, that's very, I feel like unique way of getting into teaching. At least it's the new thing that I've heard. Part of your professional career also involved visits to Belarus?
It did, yeah.
Would you mind just showing what motivated these visits, what was the reason and what you got onto while there?
Yeah, not a problem. But so just like yourselves, who clearly stumbled across my name, researched and what have you, I was contacted out of the blue by someone who headed up a group called Solicitors International Human Rights Group. And he had been tasked with forming a small team, to pay 5 to 6 visits to Belarus in order to teach the Belarusian judiciary, so judges, magistrates, the police, NGOs and anyone connected with the court system there, teach them about youth justice systems, because the thing about Belarus was that they'd never had one. They'd never had a separate youth justice system. So adults and children were being tried in the same courts, being given the same types of sentences. And they realised that, they're behind other European countries, etc. So they wanted to establish one. And the first thing they needed to do was to understand what one looked like, how it operated, and what parts of our England and Wales youth justice system they could take for their own. So this entailed 5 visits in the end. We were there for 4 days each time, doing 3 full days of teaching. Each time we went, we talked to a different group. So I think the first time it was judges, the second time it was the magistrates, the third time it was the police. Then we had some voluntary organisations that tap into the courts and things like that, and solicitors, etc. So each time we went, we kind of tweaked the materials to tailor them to the group that we were teaching to. And it proved a really positive experience where it was like a knowledge exchange partnership, if you like. We learned a terrific amount about the Belarusian justice system, and they took an awful lot from us. And there were some real differences, yet some similarities. And in many ways, I have to say that the Belarusian justice system worked and operated better than ours.
Really?
Really.
Oh, wow.
That is surprising, coming from an angle where you started saying that they didn't even have a specific youth justice system, and yet their overall system is still better than the England and Wales one.
Starting from the point of the minimum age of criminal responsibility. So that is the minimum age at which someone could be prosecuted and taken before the courts. In England and Wales, it's 10, which I believe, all my colleagues believe, practitioners, and that it is far, far too young. It's outrageously young. So Belarus, for starters, their minimum age of criminal responsibility is 14. So 4 years higher than ours. We can take a lot from that. And other things like some crimes that young people commit. So offences of so-called violence, where you've got children fighting in a schoolyard or in a park. Here in England and Wales, very often we would prosecute those children for common assault, for ABH, and they'd go before the courts, or at least receive some form of caution or diversionary activity. In Belarus, that's not classed as a crime at all. They recognise that children will be children, they will be boisterous, they will test boundaries, that fighting is a part of growing up. So it's classed as a civil matter, and if that fighting gets out of hand or it's persistent, it will be referred to their children's services. Now, we can learn a lot from that.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, just another follow-up question that I wanted from that is that, do you feel like in any way, putting young children, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds in front of a court like that, do you feel like that's sort of a scared straight tactic from the England and Wales government? Or do you think they actually believe that, these children should face repercussions?
Many people still believe that children as young as 10 know the difference between right and wrong. And it's simply not the case on the whole. They'll know the difference between right and wrong through big rights and big wrongs, but the more intricate, nuanced things, they don't have a grasp of at all. They lack the understanding, and in fact, the brain does not mature fully until the age of 25. So they're being tried and placed before a court when they have little understanding of what is happening to them at all. Would they be scared straight? Doubtful, sometimes maybe. The main point to take is that they won't understand what's happening to them on travelling to the court, on being processed in the court building, on standing there with their parent or carer. They don't really understand what's happening to them or the results of that court appearance, their children.
Have you ever wondered how did they find out about your experience? I mean, people from Belarus.
It wasn't the people from Belarus themselves that found out about my experience. It was the head of, it was a guy called Lionel Blackman, an excellent solicitor who defends people on the grounds of human rights. He was given the contract between the British Embassy and the Home Office to devise this programme, and he was given the task of finding someone who was an expert in youth justice, who he could rely upon to write the materials, to write the lectures, and all of the lectures had to be processed and subtitled and vetted, because the Belarusian culture is quite strict and conservative. So there were lots of hoops to jump through before we went there. But once we got to know the people at their university, because all the lectures took place at the Belarusian State University in their law department, funnily enough. Once there, they really began to appreciate and form a relationship with us. And it was excellent. They treated us with the utmost respect. At the end of each visit there, they'd provide us with a farewell buffet and things like that. They would try and get me to drink vodka, and I never, ever touched the stuff. I had an excuse every single time. I'm on antibiotics, but it was considered impolite not to drink the vodka, but I did manage to get away with that.
Just my personal question, did you have language barriers?
We were provided with an interpreter at all times. So we always had an interpreter more or less by our side, whatever we were doing. And the lectures, interestingly enough, we delivered them in English, of course, and the lecture theatre was like a slanting lecture theatre, go quite steeply up. At the top were situated 2 perspex boxes where you'd have 2 interpreters in there. They were interpreting simultaneously. So as I was speaking, they were interpreting. And the reason you had to have 2 was because every sentence that we speak in English, it takes 2 to 3 times as long to translate because the Russian language is more convoluted. So they got tired very quickly. So they would swap, they would literally do 10 minutes each on the translation. So language barriers, no, not really in the end.
Mm. Yeah, I do speak Russian as well. I grew up in Kazakhstan. And
Did you know? Right.
Yeah, so sometimes I have difficult moments when I try to translate or explain something to my friends from a home country. So yeah.
Yes, I can remember trying to explain the concept of an allotment to the Belarusians, and they couldn't really grasp what it actually was, what it meant. So little things like that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you've already kind of touched upon some of them, but what would you say, working with the England and Wales youth justice system and the Belarusian youth justice system, what would you say are the main differences between the two?
Well, currently, and they are in the process of changing, whereas in England and Wales, a young person between the age of 10 and 17 would go to a separate youth court and be treated distinctively and separately as a youth in that court. So the magistrates behave very differently in the youth court to what they would in an adult court. They're addressed by their first names. They're allowed to sit down. There's a lack of formality there. Whereas in Belarus, until and they're still in the process of establishing them, until they establish distinct and separate youth courts, the Belarusian youth would appear before what we would class as the magistrates' court, and it would be highly formal and things like that. Also, what I didn't note, and something that I had to delve and dig to find out about, was the Belarusian equivalent of our secure estate is very different. So our children that go into the secure estate can go into either one of 3 places. The very young will go into local authority children's secure homes, which are just like children's homes, but with big fences and barbed wire around. But the children are treated as children. Their liberty is clearly restricted. Then we've got you've got your young offenders institutions here for the older young people, and they would be run very much along the lines of prison, but again, geared to young people. In Belarus, they tend to be sent to distinct juvenile camps. However, the conditions there are far, far harsher, I have to say. Now, I didn't learn this in my visits to Belarus. It was somehow kept pretty much quiet. This is something I've found out in subsequent research where I've been writing about the Belarusian judicial system. So things like they're not allowed as many visits as our children would be. Those visits would be dependent upon good behaviour. The other thing to note is that the way that Belarus treat their young people who get involved in drugs offences, even for simple possession. So I came across a case of simple possession where a young man aged 14 had been found in possession of 2 joints of cannabis, and he got 8 years in imprisonment. So, and that would never happen in our country. So the Belarusian culture and their approach to drugs is very different to ours. It's a literal no tolerance policy. And Alexander Lukashenko, the president over there, he will not have any truck with drugs of any form.
Yeah, I think it's all over the Central Asian and the post-Soviet Union countries. Like, if you even like carry drugs or weed, anything like that, you will end up in jail.
Absolutely. Yeah. Whereas here, you'd probably get a warning on the street or a caution, depending on how much it is. The only time you'll be taken to court is if you've got other paraphernalia on you, where it looks like you might be some form of dealer, so little bags and scales and things like that. But in Belarus, just joints, just the possession of them.
Yeah, no idea it was such a harsh difference between the two. And do you think that, obviously there's some stuff that both countries could kind of, learn from each other? You mentioned this previously. What would you say is like the main thing each country should take away from each other?
I think, without going back into detail, certainly the minimum age of criminal responsibility should correspond and be exactly the same in this country, in my opinion, as Belarus. And those sort of acts of aggression between children should be treated for what they are. But the things that the Belarusian judiciary took from us were things like the concept of probation, the concept of youth justice case managers working tailored to work with young offenders. Restorative justice was something they were very, very interested in, and they've already introduced restorative justice into their practices. That was one of the first things that they took from us. So they recruited and trained a number of people dedicated to the provision of restorative justice services, where offender meets victim and there's mediation and that kind of thing. So there were learnings to be took from each other. One of the things, one of the sticking points, however, with the two judicial systems is that they adopt an inquisitorial system of justice, where it is the judges themselves that do the investigating. It's hard for us to get our heads around that, whereas we operate an adversarial system where it is you've got the defence solicitor and the prosecution solicitor arguing the case in court. The investigations are done by the police. So it's hard sometimes to compare the two in some ways.
Are you planning to work in any other countries in the future?
If I was approached to do that, I certainly would. I've been taking students over last year took them to The Hague, to the International Criminal Court. We were hoping to see a case ongoing there, but there was some form of disruption and there was nothing ongoing on that day. But we had a great visit and to that place, found out what they did, and the Peace Palace there as well. And the students really got a lot out of that trip. So this year I've put in a bid with our university to take our students to Geneva to look at the World Health Organization and the work that they do. So that's as far as international work with students or to do with the course goes at the moment. It would be nice to be approached by another country, but again, it depends on the luck of the draw if they pull me out of the bag in terms of what they want. Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of coming back to something you talked about earlier, which was your work as a probation officer, are there sort of any stories that you'd like to share that kind of show the inner workings of the system here in England and Wales, and show maybe a side that people aren't familiar with?
If we're talking about my work as a probation officer with adults, that would be a different scenario, and there are stories I can surely share with you. But obviously, this is a youth-focused organisation. So one of the stories I often tell my students is how we can make positive change for the better with young people. My forte was particularly working with young girls, aggressive and angry young girls. And I had 2 girls I'd worked with extensively because they'd been committing minor crimes and now and again appearing before the court. They'd always got a supervision order, and I'd been working with them on that. But on one particular time, they got involved in what we could consider here as a serious fight in a park, which the Belarusians would not consider serious at all. And they appeared before the youth court and then were committed up to the Crown Court because their crimes were deemed too serious. I think they were on the cusp between ABH and GBH with the injuries that they'd caused to their victims, so-called victims. So they appeared before one of the judges in the Crown Court, and I'd written their pre-sentence reports. So before most young people are sentenced through the courts, particularly in Crown, they will have what is known as a pre-sentence report written on them that gives details of their background, their offending behaviour, their previous offences, what led up to the commission of this offence, what happened, and what our recommendation would be in terms of sentence. And I'd written both girls' pre-sentence reports and showed them I drew out, let's say, their positive sides. So the things they'd been doing at the school, the things they did in the local community, and drew all that out. So it seemed like a fairly glowing report, whilst acknowledging the damage done to the victims and their criminal behaviour as a whole. And they appeared before the judge, and the judge sentenced them to terms of imprisonment. And off the top of my head, it was something like 12 months each they got. And one of the young girls was so kind of taken aback by the sentence and the fear, I think, that it induced, that she lashed out even in the booth in court. So she threatened the judge. She said, if you stick with what you're trying to do to us, i.e. lock us up, I'm going to come and I'm going to burgle your house and do something unspeakable into his wig. So, sorry? 14.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So the judge took great exception to this, and the young girl who said those words was given an extra 6 months on top of the already 1 year. And of course, I was then summoned into judges' chambers to explain myself and how come I'd written these reports when quite clearly there's unresolved issues and they're still being like this. So, I tried to justify what I did. It was an unexpected outburst. And again, I worked alongside the girl while she was inside, helped her to draft a letter, a personal letter to the judge to apologise for her behaviour, form of restorative justice, if you like. The judge received and read that letter, had her back before the court eventually, and reduced the sentence back down. But the main point to take from this is when both girls were released, one of them stopped offending, well, they both stopped offending completely. And that was to do with the close work we'd done with them whilst in the secure estate. One of them, I managed to get a place for her on a week-long residential course with a group that were then called Youth at Risk. And they went up into, I think it was the Peak District, and they did all their outdoor activities. And I went up to visit them and stop one night and spent a couple of days with them. So still supporting them then. And lo and behold, several more years down the line, and the young girl that went on this course then became one of their workers. She began to work for that charity, doing the same thing and helping other young offenders. And the other one got heavily involved in charitable organisations in her community and still works in that field to this day. So it is surprising how your work and the way you approach your work with the young people can affect their futures. It can change them.
Yeah, it's a really nice story. Did you find it difficult, like working with maybe a lot of children who were maybe had like a short temper, maybe like very, how do you say?
Like angry issues.
Yeah. Was it difficult kind of dealing with them and finding a middle ground to try and guide them in a right path?
I would say, and I do mean this from the bottom of my heart, I never, ever had a problem with anybody, either youth or adult, who had anger issues. And it's simply because it's the approach that you take. It's the way that you listen to them. It's the tone of your voice. It's the expression on your face. It's your body language. If they realise you're not intimidated by what they're saying, that you're not going to be frightened, that you're accepting, you're not going to run out the room and speak to them in an authoritative voice, and that you're still there, then they always change their behaviour. And there's also little things about getting those young people who wouldn't normally have a voice, those young people, and there were many, that you'd talk to and all you get back would be a bowed head and a grunt. They wouldn't engage because they didn't know how to. So you then have to find ways, and I always managed to find a way to work with them, and quickly realised that it hardly ever works if you're sitting opposite, be there a desk in front of you or not. You're asking questions of a young offender directly, face to face. That very rarely works. They feel intimidated. So you get them to sit like we are beside you. And how you get them to do that can be, you have to use kind of some ingenuity and some intelligence. So my main go-to thing was to say to them, all right, I can see that you're not very talkative at the moment. Let's go and get a McDonald's, and then we'll sit and talk after. So immediately get them in the car and they're sat side by side, then you can't shut them up. They won't stop. They won't stop talking, literally, because they feel then that they don't feel intimidated. They feel in control more. You're going to do something that they're going to enjoy. They're glad that you've taken them for that treat. It's surprising the little tricks you can use. Yeah. And I've been threatened, but it's always been empty threats in my role over 20 years. That's adults and young people. But no one's ever lifted a finger to me, ever. And that always surprises the students. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially with, it depends like how long you've worked in an area. You'd assume that after some point you'd encounter some sort of, not really danger, but I guess, more than just empty threats. But, it's really nice to hear that everyone has that approachable side.
Yes.
And coming from that, are there any sort of research projects that maybe you're working on that delves into this sort of behavior, or any research projects that you like to share?
Well, we're just in the process of finishing up a big research project that we did in conjunction with the police and the Violence Reduction Unit. And that was to examine why Nottingham have Nottingham has a high rate of first-time entrants into the youth justice system. So it's higher in Nottingham than it is in Nottinghamshire, so in the county, and higher in Nottingham compared to like-sized town cities. That are similar in demographics as well. So there was a research team. There were 3 of us doing much of the field work. Some were interviewing young people. I was interviewing practitioners, current practitioners in youth justice in the field, as well as stakeholders. So people that worked for the Youth Justice Board, that worked for Notts County Council. The interviews with the young people were done by my colleagues. And also one of the things we were tasked to look at was the proliferation of knife crime. And what we found was it was the differing practices of the police and courts to some extent as to why there were so many first-time entrants. So in Nottingham, you've got slightly different policies to what they use in the county. Use of things like Outcome 22, which is a form of, it's not a caution and it's not formal, it's just a different way of dealing on paper with young offenders committing lower tariff, less serious offences. However, one of the problems we've got with knife crime, and I'm not minimising the extent of it, the impact of it at all, is that many children and young people who carry knives carry them for various different reasons. So some will carry them for perceived need for protection. Others will carry them for legitimate reasons. They're going fishing with their uncle, or and they've been caught in possession. Some young girls have been caught in possession of knives when they've they've taken these knives into school in order to perform self-harm on themselves. Now, anyone caught in possession of a knife, particularly in school, is in for a rough ride, no matter what the reason is they brought it in for. So they can bring it in with never having any intention of using it, but still become excluded from school. So that kind of seems to be a blanket policy, which can then lead them into a life of crime. School exclusion is the biggest predictor and indicator of young people getting involved in crime. So I think the knife crime problem is not as big as perhaps the media would have us perceive it as. It's more about possession, where nothing's ever done with those knives, although granted they shouldn't be carrying them in the first place. So yeah, the Violence Reduction Project. And I'm just about to embark on some different research, which is totally different to youth offending, although it will still encompass some. And that is, myself and a colleague are going to be looking at mental health in the archive. So we're going to be going back to the late 1800s and finding newspaper articles down at the Central Library on crimes that were committed back then, whether they be juvenile crime or adult crime, and seeing what the types of crimes were, what their sentences were, and where these young people or adults were sentenced to what were known then as the old lunatic asylums. They could be sentenced from court to the old lunatic asylums. We're then going to peruse the archives of those old asylums to match up the crime reports in the newspaper and then what happened to them whilst in the mental health facility, just to compare how we dealt with crime, particularly those mentally disordered offenders, how we dealt with them back then compared to how we deal with them now. Was it better? Was it worse? Are there similarities? And that kind of thing. So slightly off topic with youth justice, but will involve youth crime as well, because young people could still be placed in the asylum.
Yeah. Well, the work you're doing is very important, essential, I would say. Do you have any advice for parents or for your colleagues who are dealing with, can I say, difficult children?
Yeah, I think one of the main things that I've learned over the many years of experience, and then through research and teaching and the research that you do for teaching, is for both parents and people wanting to work with young people, is to know that 85% of children in the youth justice system have some form of learning disability, mental health condition, ADHD, neurodiversity issues. So when all put together, it's 85%. So my advice to parents would be, if you feel that your child is behaving in a challenging manner and you're being told that your child is naughty for naughty's sake because it's the way that you've parented them or it's attachment difficulties, then to make sure they push for assessment for neurodiversity. The actual figure, the official figure for those on the neurodiverse spectrum in the youth justice system is 1 in 3. Bear in mind that's the official figure, so that's those who have received a diagnosis. There are many undiagnosed, and in my own research, I found out that my research demonstrated that it was at least 2 in 3. And those included those suspected to be on the spectrum because of their behaviour and the training that the youth justice practitioners had in recognising it, but remained undiagnosed. And often it's difficult for parents to get their children diagnosed because they don't know how to go about it. It's an arduous process, it's complex. You can fall at many hurdles, and even once diagnosis is provided and established, they then have the difficult field to negotiate of securing funding and resources to help that young person to lead a more fulfilling life that doesn't involve going down the route of crime. So, and again, for practitioners or colleagues working still in the field, it's to acknowledge this, to ensure that our courts are familiar and are trained. We need magistrates to be trained to recognise what has driven, what's motivated the crime that has come before them that day, and to understand and take account of if it's something to do with neurodiversity. Yes, courts still have to balance out the need to protect the society from dangerous offenders and to protect victims, but they also, I believe, have a duty to our young people to acknowledge at the very least the conditions that they have and to put resources in places that can work alongside that. Traditional manners of working with young offenders often won't impact upon those with neurodiverse issues.
So what you're saying is basically everybody needs like specific approach, right? So some people have like ADHD or learning disability. So there is no like a written rule or general approach for kids.
I think the main thing to take from it is to acknowledge that whether a child's got ADHD and is displaying challenging behaviour, or whether they're neurodiverse and are doing things that they don't understand are unlawful, or that they're wrong, or what the impact of what they're saying or doing will be, is that with the right resources in places over the course of their childhood, such as being referred and being worked with by organisations like Autism East Midlands, who are an excellent organisation helping these young people, then most people on the spectrum who've been worked with and have received the resources and funding necessary grow out. They'll grow out of youth offending completely. If it remains undiagnosed, untouched, they could go on forever.
Yeah. So in a way, what you're saying is that, in order for youth justice to improve as a whole, and the whole justice system to deal with young people better, there also needs to be an improvement in the way that mental health is tackled amongst young people.
Absolutely, and all of it in all of its guises. So in our culturally and in our society, we're very reluctant and loath to diagnose specific mental health difficulties. So it's very rare a young person will be diagnosed with something like bipolar, with schizophrenia, because they tend to wait until they've at least reached the age of 18, because a diagnosis could be given where actually what the traits that they're displaying could be something completely different. And it has been the case that a child with neurodiverse issues or autistic could be given a diagnosis of things like personality disorder, when it's not the case at all, because some of their symptoms, if you like, that they're displaying mimic each other. So with personality disorder, you would say that many would have a complete lack of empathy. However, that can seemingly be the case in children with neurodiversity issues, because with autism, many children lack what we know as the theory of mind, and that is the ability to stand in someone else's shoes, to feel what they're feeling and thinking. Often those on the spectrum don't have that ability like the rest of us do. So there can be some overspill between the diagnoses, but certainly mental health issues and everything I've just mentioned is one of the biggest drivers of young people committing crime. Obviously, you've got your more well-known ones: poverty, deprivation, destitution, peer pressure, that would contribute significantly as well. So I would say the main drivers for young people committing crime that we need to target and concentrate on are features of neurodiversity and that all-important school exclusion. Nottingham are something like the third highest area in the country for school exclusions. We exclude far more people than most towns and cities, and it can cause untold problems, and exclusions can come for a variety of reasons. They will say that this person's displaying challenging behaviour, we can't cope with it, they're disrupting the learning of other students, when really the issues is that school funding has been cut to the quick, and where you've got behavioural units in school employing 14, 15 staff, they're sometimes down to 2 and even 1 now. And so it's a bigger issue, and that's why I think we're seeing more school exclusions, leading to higher rates of first-time entrants.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that's all the questions that I had. Would you like to add anything to it, Aidan?
I have a personal question. Like, do you have, for example, parents, so their kids carry a knife, and but they have no idea how to deal with it? Do you have any like book recommendations or maybe YouTube videos how to like start approaching?
So working with a parent, for example, whose child is carrying a knife and they don't know how to deal with it, they've tried this and that, what we would tend to do is work with them on parenting contracts. So whether that be a court-issued parenting order or voluntarily to work with us, and we would teach them either in group settings or one-to-one on the different ways that those sorts of things can be dealt with. It can be tricky. And again, it's trying to find out why that young person is carrying the knife. What is their beliefs? What's their perceptions? And how can we kind of cut through that?
Well, growing up, I also had friends who carry a knife just because they seek validation.
Yes.
Or like just carry a knife because their friends carry a knife.
That's right. That's right.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think parents need to talk to each other.
That's true. There's lots of reasons to carry a knife. Also, I believe one of the main ones, or one of the ones that puts people at risk of carrying knives, is if they've been a victim to just violence in the past. It makes them either feel safer or they seek it as a way of protection.
Yes, and that was exactly, all of that came out in our research. And often young people were kind of lacked the understanding of the level of damage the type of knife they're carrying could inflict. They really have no idea. So you have the police working alongside them, showing them pictures of wounds and what it can cause and which types of knives cause which types of wounds. So, and that can be helpful because their brains are not formed and they will just go along with the crowd quite often.
Yeah.
Most of the young people, they don't have their own opinion. So they just follow their friends or somebody on Instagram.
That's right.
Or social media. Yeah. But I think it's not only about knife. I think it's also related to smoking or drinking.
Yes.
So yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to the discussion?